Welcome to Red, White, and Blue. From the right, I'm Gary Paulin.
And from the left, I'm David Jones.
Tonight we welcome the United States 22nd Secretary of Labor. I didn't know we had that many. Robert Reich. He's also a professor at the University of California at Berkeley and the author of a new book, Aftershock, The Next Economy in America's Future. Obviously very important subjects, David.
I think so. Aftershock, as I understand it, is what we can expect our voting population, our consuming population, to be doing after the failure of this brief little recovery that we've had. Am I getting that right?
Well, pretty much. The aftershock is the brief little recovery. I mean, it's not really a recovery. Most Americans, they know that technically the recession has been declared over, but they don't feel like it's over at all. This is not like the so-called recovery of any previous recession that people remember. This is high unemployment, slow economic growth, a lot of people still losing their homes and their savings and their jobs.
I have to tell you, when I read an op-ed piece that you wrote some weeks back, obviously tailored after the book, I went, oh my, I understand. Because what I understood was that, we've got a population of people who don't have a lot of money. We've got a top 1%, 5%, whatever it is, who have a great deal, 23% of national income. And you say that's pretty much the same thing happened in 1927, 1928, and that until those people get some money back in their pockets, and you can tell us how they're going to get that money, that we can't expect much of a recovery.
Well, obviously, the Great Recession is not nearly and was not nearly as deep as the Great Depression, but there are some very interesting similarities, and you pointed out one just now, David, and that is that if you look at the percentage or share of total national income going to the top 1%, the peak years, where over 23.5% of total national income went to the top, were 1928 and 2007. And then you have to ask yourself, now, what is it that happened in 1929 and 2008? Could there be some sort of relationship? And obviously, you don't want to make too much out of two data points, but there is a relationship in that Mariner Eccles, who I feature in the book, who was the chairman of the Federal Reserve Board, Federal Reserve System from 1934 to 1948. Mariner Eccles, when he looked at the Great Depression, said what happened here is that there was simply too much income at the very top, which made it impossible for the vast middle class and working class of America to have the purchasing power they needed to buy up what the economy was capable of producing at or near full employment without going deep into debt. And of course, that debt bubble would eventually have to burst. Not unlike what we experienced in the decades leading up to the Great Recession.
And the debt bubble did burst. But it's interesting, you talk about 23% of the national income going to the top 1%. I've checked some statistics. The top 1% pay 35% of all income tax. So you also talk in your book about we need more progressive income tax. The rich need to pay more. It seems to me like the rich are paying pretty good. Top 10% pays 65%. Top 25% pays 83% of the income tax. So how much more progressive do we need to get?
I'll tell you, instead of looking at totals, what you need to do is look at individuals and see what their marginal tax rate is. Now, in the book, I don't argue for going back to Dwight Eisenhower's marginal tax rate. That was 91% on top incomes. Or even the marginal tax rate during the World War II or under John F. Kennedy. But the marginal tax rate, generally speaking, from the end of the Second World War until the mid-1970s, was above 70% on highest incomes. Now, if you believed in supply-side economics, you would say, that's terrible, that's confiscatory, that takes away the incentive of anybody at the top to work hard, and that must mean the economy performed very poorly during those years. Actually, the economy did much better during those years than it has since, in part, I think, because the broad middle class actually got a lot of investment in highways and bridges and infrastructure and education. Public higher education was expanded enormously. There were investments in the capacity of the public to do more. Again, and if the public was able to produce more, the public was able to also pay taxes that in turn were invested in everything from more roads and bridges and better infrastructure to better education. We also rebuilt Japan. We rebuilt Europe in the years after the Second World War.
Well, we're trying to rebuild Iraq.
Well, I think we're not trying to rebuild America, actually. But
Well, the trouble, that's the problem, Gary. If you look at all of the studies of deferred maintenance on our infrastructure, you've got to be concerned. Unlike the 50s, 60s, and 70s, where we actually did have a National Defense Highway Act, we created a vast infrastructure, and we repaired the old infrastructure, replaced it. We have now so much deferred maintenance in this country that we have pipelines bursting and bridges crumbling, and we've got ports that are in terrible disrepair.
Which is, I guess, an indictment of our politicians who have not provided leadership in terms of investing in infrastructure. And by the way, that goes to both parties. It's easy to kick those long-term projects down the road and deal with the more immediate earmarks for God knows what, and not take care of the serious things.
Absolutely.
One of the people that you probably read, as Gary and I do, is this fellow Krugman in the New York Times, and he basically says to Gary and his friends, what big spending program is this stimulus thing that you people are worried about so much? Talk to us about whether or not you agree with Mr. Krugman that this was a blip on the radar screen in terms of what this economy might have needed to give it a more sustained growth pattern.
Well, look, in most recessions, you have a recovery that comes after the recession, because recession is brought on because the Federal Reserve Board actually raises interest rates too high to head off inflation. That's been typical in our past recessions. This Great Recession has been something very different. It marks a tremendous bursting of an asset bubble, which means consumers don't have the wherewithal, most consumers, to continue to spend. The reason that big companies are not investing in more capacity is that they have no reason to if they're not consumers out there. So from a classic or a neoclassic Keynesian perspective, if you believe in Keynesian economics, and a lot of people don't, you don't care. Well,
you voted for Nixon. He did.
Yeah, John Maynard Keynes, I think, is being exhumed because we see now that there is a huge gap between the productive potential of the economy at full employment and where the economy is right now. If consumers and government and exports and business won't fill that gap, then how is the gap going to be filled? Government spending has got to be enough to prime the pump and get people back to work so they can turn around and spend.
But haven't we also exported a lot of our productive capacity overseas? I mean, we've done that.
You sound like a lefty, and I just don't think
that's my populism streak. That we've sent jobs overseas. I think it's true. We have.
Well, look, I don't think that globalization is a bad thing. I think that it's not a zero-sum game.
No.
In which either they get a good job or we get a good job. In fact, we rebuilt Japan and Europe after the Second World War, partly to stave off communism, Soviet communism, but also partly because we knew that our own growth and development depended upon a wealthy Europe and a wealthy Japan capable of being strong trading partners with us. I don't look upon China as an enemy. I mean, yes, China ought to reevaluate their currency, appreciate their currency. China, I don't think China has a terrible record in human rights. I think we ought to be as aggressive as we can with them on certain score. But China is not the reason we now have massive unemployment. China is not the reason we are in this, still the gravitational pull of this great recession.
In fact, there's an argument that China has helped subsidize our consumer economy. By keeping their currency tied to the dollar, it's made it more affordable for our people to go and shop at stores where most of the stuff is imported anyway.
Well, that's right. In fact, Gary, David, the view that a lot of people have about what caused the Great Recession is that Wall Street was irresponsible. Wall Street was excessive in terms of what they did, the gambles they made. I think that's the proximate cause. But I think there's an underlying cause. And that underlying cause is not that Americans spent beyond their means. It's that their means did not keep up with what a rapidly growing economy should have and could have been able to provide the vast American middle class and working class. So instead, they had to go deeper and deeper into debt.
You're saying that the only way that Americans have kept up is to have had women go into the workplace. And then this other coping mechanism, I think you call it, has to do with credit cards and borrowing against, their appreciated assets, mostly homes, which created the the great bubble. But
That's right.
but the psychological element to it is what I gathered, is that we all just want to be rich like Gary here, and so we're going to do whatever we can, to keep this gig going.
Well, I don't
it's
make
not
the top.
that it's not that we all want to be rich. I'm not going to pry,
I don't make
Gary.
the top 1%. I promise you.
I think it's that we in America have come to assume, and the great American middle class and working class have come to assume, that if the economy grows, then naturally our standard of living should rise somewhat. And the stark reality is that if you looked at the typical male wage in 2007, and you compared it to the typical male wage 30 years before, and you adjust for inflation, that typical male was not earning any more in 2007 than that typical male did in 1977, 1978. In other words, male wages stagnated, even though the economy grew dramatically. That's why most, I would love to say that women went into the workplace, into paid work, because of all the wonderful professional opportunities open to women. Well, yes, but that was not the major reason that women streamed into work. They streamed into work because they wanted to prop up family incomes that were stagnating or declining. And then coping mechanism number 2, everybody works longer hours. When I was Secretary of Labor, I was astounded to see, and the Bureau of Labor Statistics showed this, that the typical American was working 350 hours more than the typical European, more hours even than the industrious Japanese. And then coping mechanism number 3 was going deeper and deeper into debt. But of course, now, and this is the stark and I think profound and disturbing reality we have to face, all those coping mechanisms are now over. Where then do we get sufficient, call it aggregate demand, call it customers, whatever, for all the goods and services we could provide?
But don't you think it'd be a good idea if we step back and take a look at the country in the 21st century and ask ourselves, what kind of tax system do we want to have that would bring in adequate revenue for the government to do what it's supposed to do, not everything everyone wishes it do, regardless of party, and also leave and incentivize individuals to be successful, to make money, to create jobs in the country? My bet is it wouldn't be the system we have now.
I agree with you. 80% of Americans pay more in payroll taxes than they do in income taxes.
Social Security tax.
Social Security, but payroll taxes also involve Medicare and unemployment insurance. So what you might want to do, and one thing that I have suggested, is that you exempt the first $20,000 of income from payroll taxes, and you make it up by applying payroll taxes to incomes over $250,000. For example, a lot of my conservative friends say, that's actually a good idea. That would put money in people's pockets. They could then turn around and buy things. That would be an incentive for employers because they wouldn't have to pay Social Security tax on their first $20,000. And it would be very progressive at the same time.
But we have to bring in some revenue, don't we? I mean, and if we do, your solutions for that would include a 55% top rate and capital gains taxed at the same rate. Is that correct?
Yes, but more importantly, in the book I talk about a carbon tax. Now, that may not be terribly popular here in Texas, but let me just tell you why I think it's important. Because if we create enough incentives to develop alternative energy sources, the only way you're going to do it is through the market. You can't direct people to use wind or biomass or anything else that is a non-carbon source. You've got to create incentives that reflect the social costs of using carbon-based fuels. So if you had a carbon tax that reflected that was even generally related to how much Europe or Japan or anybody else pays for their carbon-based fuels, you would generate enough revenue that you could reduce just about everybody's taxes, everybody in the middle class, everybody in the working class. You could actually provide them with a wage subsidy. They would do so much better than they were doing before. You could pay off the long-term debt. You could deal with the needs in this country for infrastructure and education. Why don't we do it?
Well, first of all, I don't know whether it'll work or not, but I know we're not going to pay off the debt because it just doesn't happen. I mean, when President Clinton, in his second term, when the Republicans had taken control of the Congress, kind of did his mid-course correction and decided how he was going to go forward to lead the country in I would say, the second half of his first term and then the second term, a very effective way. I mean, I think I've said on the show, David, before, that if you look at the modern presidents and why the American people, I think, are enamored with divided government, it's the success that President Clinton had with the Republicans in Congress. They got things done. They got control. They got control of spending and the budget. And when we had one-party government with President Bush and the Republicans, spending went crazy.
Actually,
Democrats had one-party government. They went spending beyond crazy.
Well, I was there, and I can tell you the budget was balanced a year before the law required it to be balanced. Why was it balanced so much earlier? Because the economy was growing. Why was the economy growing? Because interest rates were down, and because not only did the president raise taxes slightly to cover all of the investments he needed to make, but he made critical investments in infrastructure and education, which improved the productivity of the country, including retraining. So all of those came together. We had very, very rapid economic growth, and we balanced the budget before even the Republican Congress and the Democrats decided that they were going to do it.
There's a Jones in your book, and
but it's not you,
No, it's not me, no relation that I know of. Margaret, and she's elected in your book in 2020, and a platform that is one that I think you would say comes out of this sort of anger that is in the country now, represented by the Tea Party crowd, who are seeing that the economy is rigged for people of wealth and power, and everyone else is getting left out just to take the crumbs. When is that anger, you think, going to manifest itself into the type of radical, if it is, radical change, whether it be your way or, Gary's way?
Well, look at David, I think that the anger is already manifesting itself. We have now a lot of anger and resentment directed at immigrants, at Muslims, at the poor, at gay people. I have seen an upsurge, and we all are witnessing an upsurge in anger against groups that have nothing to do with the economic crisis, but because people are, and we look at this has happened before in American history, because people are so frustrated and they are so worried about their own families and their incomes, they are, many of them, prone to listen to demagogues who essentially say your problem is related to them or them or them or them. 61% of people who identify with the so-called Tea Party, they say that foreign trade, international trade, is bad for the United States. That is more than the typical American. We are seeing, I fear, the beginnings of a period of isolationism, nativism, jingoism,
what about
xenophobia.
The left, though, Bob Reich?
It's on the left, too.
Well,
it's on the left.
They thought Obama was going to be an FDR. Isn't it unfair for them to have thought that he could be such a person when even FDR wasn't FDR until 3 years into the Depression? Mr. Obama got the job, well into, but not that far in advance of these dismal times.
Look, presidents are blamed or credited for what happens to the economy, often in disproportionate degree to what a president can actually do. Bill Clinton was credited with a fabulous economy in the 1990s. I was part of his administration. I was honored to be part of that administration, but I'm the first to tell you that policies had something to do with it, but not everything. I mean, the economy did well because the timing was right and because the Fed did some things that it had to do.
And we're further down the line here. We had one bubble after another. We had the high-tech bubble, and then we had this bubble, that bubble, finally the real estate bubble blowing up. But the anger in the country y'all talked about, isn't it fair to say that the anger started really in 2006 with the Democrats being angry with Republicans and Republican institutions and people they identify, and that fueled the Democratic success in 2006 and was the fuel behind the Obama rise that he would be the answer to their problems.
Well,
and remember, Obama ran not like Bill Clinton did with the grassroots. Obama ran as above us all, that he was going to bring us all together. He was a new kind of politician, of course, till he wasn't.
Well, look at Gary. Every politician says that they're a new kind of politician. But what we saw in 1992 with Bill Clinton, and it's the economy stupid, is the same thing we saw with really the end of the first Bush administration. And that was the Federal Reserve Board raising interest rates and pushing the economy into a terrible downspin. We saw the same thing really with the end of the Carter administration. The Federal Reserve Board raised interest rates to break the back of inflation and broke the back of the Carter administration, ushering in the Reagan administration. Whenever the economy is bad, the current incumbent president and also the incumbent party takes a shellacking. And you and I and David could have an interesting discussion about how much the George W. Bush administration is to blame for what happened in 2008 and 2009. But it doesn't matter.
Not now.
It doesn't matter now because it is now by the public deemed to be President Obama's economy. And if he and the Democratic leadership in Congress have not been able to fix it, regardless of how recalcitrant the Republicans have been in not enabling them to enact certain legislation, doesn't matter.
Well, the Democrats had a vast majority.
The public says,
right, so
you have not solved the problem.
Let's talk about your advice. If you're going to give advice to President Obama, you're going to have you have a mixed government. You're going to have to deal with another party now. How do you go forward with solving the country's problems and try to get the country on the right track?
Well, first of all, I'd urge him, modesty aside, to read my new book. But beyond that, I would urge him to say something that I think needs to be said that links all of the policies together, that connects the dots, which is something that, with all due respect, I don't think he's done very well. And that is, to the people who are very wealthy and privileged and have come out wonderfully well after this great recession, look, you stand to gain more from having a smaller share of a rapidly growing economy that fosters a positive politics than having a large share of an economy that is anemic, that is almost dead in the water, and that fosters a very negative and isolationist politics.
Well, you also have to come up to the plate here, step up to the plate here, and talk about what went wrong with the efforts that they made to save this economy, which I guess you and others would agree, at least what they did in the beginnings of Obama's term did something as far as softening the recession. So, what else could they have done?
Well, David, it's easy to be a Monday morning quarterback. I'd say, in retrospect, the bailout of Wall Street should have come with more strings. You should have said to the big Wall Street banks, you've got to make it easier for lenders who are underwater and in danger of being foreclosed upon to reorganize those mortgage payments and those mortgages. Number two, you've got to get money into communities through small businesses. You've got to make sure small businesses are not squeezed out and frozen out of these loans. Number three, you've got to put some limits on banker bonuses and banker salaries and link them to long-term compensation. Number four, you've got to stop lobbying Congress, or at least have a moratorium on Wall Street lobbying, because Wall Street now, unfortunately, is one of the major sources of campaign donations for both Republicans and Democrats. I would go down a list. I'd say, if Wall Street wants to get bailed out, Wall Street, you've got to agree to these conditions. Now, the failure to have those conditions, I think, is a blot on the administration.
And a moratorium on foreclosures, certainly. Is that not?
A moratorium, or at least allow foreclosures, at least allow mortgages to be part of personal bankruptcy,
right.
Which they are not now by law.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, you talked about Wall Street and what happened. Didn't we have it set up before the collapse on Wall Street where you were encouraged to take risk, and you basically had a mattress to fall on if you failed?
That's
so
right.
Too
That's
big
right.
to fail.
Socialism for the wealthy and capitalism for everybody else. Too big to fail should not ever have occurred. And what happened is you now have, instead of 6 big Wall Street banks, you have 4 giant Wall Street banks, and you have a financial reform bill that goes a distance but still doesn't go as far as it could. There should have been caps placed on the size that Wall Street banks could grow. I mean, we look at the oil companies. We use the antitrust laws against the oil companies the first part of the 20th century. We broke up Ma Bell. If you've got these colossal financial institutions that are too big to fail, that really have the political process around its throat.
Now, I liked one thing you said. You talked about bonuses should be tied to long-term performance.
Then, let me just finish that sentence. Then antitrust laws or capping the size of banks would be appropriate, it seems to me. I'm sorry.
Well, because what was happening is people were getting bonuses on short-term performance, like at Lehman Brothers. They all got bonuses. They got big bonuses. AIG, They got big bonuses, and
Of
then
course.
the companies failed, and the public bailed them out. Did the people pay back the bonuses?
No, they didn't pay back the bonuses.
Oh,
Of course
my
not. I mean, you
goodness.
have Goldman Sachs that got $13 billion through AIG. AIG gets bailed out. AIG then owes Goldman Sachs $13 billion. AIG fulfills 100% of its obligation to Goldman Sachs. Does Goldman Sachs then pay back the taxpayers for bailing out AIG? No.
You've got to tell us in 30 seconds why we should read the Supreme Court opinion, Citizens United.
Because Stevens' dissent in Citizens United is the most articulate statement of why money in politics ultimately corrodes our democracy.
And he's coming to town, Mr. Stevens.
Well, maybe we should bring him on the show, David. We can ask him about his opinion.
No, it's an eloquent statement. And I think, honestly, Citizens United will go down in history with Dred Scott and Gore against Bush as the 3 worst Supreme Court decisions ever promulgated.
Thank you, Bob Reich.
pretty clear.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Come back and see us. We invite you to visit our home online at HoustonPBS.org. Click on the local program bar for Red, White, and Blue. Read about our guests, watch the shows, follow up discussion with Gary if you must. Until next time, get informed and get active.